Most people haven't heard the name Marcia Lucas before. She's the elusive and forgotten part of the making of the original Star Wars trilogy. She's only given 2 interviews in the past 30 years, and even then, not much is really even known about her. Before then, she's only briefly mentioned in interviews with other people, despite editing some of the most celebrated and greatest films of all time. She was George Lucas's wife and closest advisor during the original trilogy, and she was one of Martin Scorsese's regular editors in the 1970s. I've always been fascinated by the story and work of Marcia Lucas, someone who I've always come back to, hoping I can maybe unlock some secrets about what she did. Did she save Star Wars like they always said? And is she the main reason the original trilogy is what it is? I've never really been able to shake her. She just always seems interesting and important to me. So let me put it this way. If you heard about someone who edited American Graffiti, Taxi Driver, Star Wars, and Return of the Jedi, worked with George Lucas and Martin Scorsese, and then her huge divorce settlement indirectly caused Lucasfilm to sell Pixar to Steve Jobs, wouldn't you want to know about her? This is Marcia Lucas, the heart of Star Wars. Marcia Lucas happened upon film editing, the film industry, and George Lucas only by chance. She was supposed to work at a Hollywood memorabilia museum, but the California State Employment Office instead assigned her to work at the Sandler Film Library, a stock footage house where Marcia learned her trade. It was hard work, but she ended up loving it, and film editing as well. She was then hired by Verna Fields, who would later edit Jaws and had the amazing and awesome nickname Mother Cutter. She needed someone to work on a short about President Johnson's trip to the Far East for the U.S. Information Agency. Since there was so much footage coming in, Verna had to hire even more assistants and found some film school kids from USC. One of these USC kids who was assigned to work with Marcia was George Lucas. Marcia would always be a close collaborator to George Lucas, first as his girlfriend and then as his wife. She edited George's first post-USC film, Filmmaker, about the making of Francis Ford Coppola's The Rain People, which Marcia would also be an assistant editor on. She kept working as an assistant editor after that on films like Medium Cool with Verna Fields and The Candidate, as well as THX 1138 for George. Marcia said this about THX. I like to become emotionally involved in a movie. I want to be scared. I want to cry. I never cared for THX because it left me cold. I personally don't really like THX 1138. It's not really very good and sort of just a 1984 ripoff that we only care about because that dude made Star Wars, but whatever, that's just me. Marcia Lucas's next collaboration with her husband would be the film that launched both of them professionally to the next level. It's also the film that shows Marcia's strength as a collaborator and editor in making a film what it was. American Graffiti was George's more emotional, fun, crowd-pleasing movie that reflected his Modesto, California upbringing. It was a mess in the editing room, first edited by Verna Fields to a rough cut to George's specifications, but she had to leave because she had other shit to do. George's original idea for American Graffiti was to have much more cross-cutting, A plot, B plot, C plot, D plot, but kind of a plot structure. Part like TV and part like stupid. Marcia did cut the film how George wanted it, but that didn't work. So she took it upon herself and edited it under its own rhythm. American Graffiti moves and flows like a night out as a teenager should. Impulsive, spontaneous, going with its own flow. American Graffiti is really a film made by its editing. It feels so natural, like a hangout or party movie, while also having the feeling that everyone is going to go off in different directions once the night is over. It has this fleeting feeling that you can't shake. No one-night movie about a group of high school kids has ever flowed as well as American Graffiti, and it probably inspired all the films that came after it. They could never get the feeling of being out with your friends and ready to take on the adventure of the night that film did. George certainly put that in there, but Marcia, through her editing, is the one who gave it the flow that made that movie. American Graffiti was a huge hit, and both Marcia and George were nominated for Academy Awards that year. Neither would win, but it helped establish them both, and also helped them become millionaires as well. Although despite all that, many weren't actually sure what she really did, and felt that George maybe deserved more of the credit for editing Graffiti. She would say to that, if I'm ever going to get any real credit, I'm going to have to cut a movie for somebody else besides George. Because if I'm cutting for my husband, they're going to think, George let his wife play around in the cutting room. Her next film would be Martin Scorsese's first studio picture and a 30s woman's picture throwback, Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore. Scorsese was making sure a majority of his crew were women so he could get a more emotionally honest film. This would be an important film for Marcia, as she would be the sole credited editor. This was also a crucial point for Martin Scorsese. He was a critical darling after Mean Streets and the hot director at the time. He wasn't sure if he wanted Alice to settle down or to have the more typical 70s bummer ending. He was sure he would never have a financial success and would rather just satisfy the critics, until Marcia and Sandra Weintraub told him, "You've got to put it back. It's really more of the honest heart of the film."
Oh, sure.
Marcia was an editor who always seemed to understand the emotional truth of the movie she's working on, and Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore needed that ending to stay the way it was. Alice was a hit with critics and a bigger hit with audiences. Scorsese liked working with Marcia, who would then be the supervising editor on his next film, Taxi Driver. There really aren't as many editing stories with Taxi Driver that have anything to do with Marcia, except that it took forever to get the end scene just right because of arguments with the studio and the MPAA. But watching it close to Alice, it shows a more mature flow of the editing. It's almost like the intense, always moving, crazy cocaine-fueled camera work on Mean Streets and Alice was gone for a more mature, deep dive into insanity with Travis Bickle. Of all the films that Marcia edited, this one feels like the least structured, which really makes it much more of an achievement. The big difference between her work with Scorsese and George Lucas is probably that in a Scorsese film, the film is always there. It doesn't have to be guided as much. A film like Taxi Driver almost flows like it's on its own plane of existence, almost like the dark and scattered worldview of its protagonist. While Marcia was off working with Scorsese, George Lucas was working on the script for the movie that's the whole reason you really care about any of this, Star Wars. It took George years to nail down a script for Star Wars, and as he was writing and rewriting and going through drafts, Marcia gave him a suggestion that Ben Kenobi dies while they're at the Death Star, to really emphasize the stakes with the Empire. No! George said this in a 1977 interview with Rolling Stone. "I was rewriting. I was struggling with that plot problem when my wife suggested that I kill off Ben, which she thought was a pretty outrageous idea, and I said, well, this is an interesting idea. But then the more I thought about Ben getting killed, the more I liked the idea." Star Wars had a rough production, and an even rougher time in editing. George wanted Richard Chew to cut the film originally, but it was cheaper to use someone who already had a working visa in the UK, as this is where they would film most of Star Wars. So he instead hired editor John Jimson, most known for cutting A Hard Day's Night. That cut, known as the lost cut of Star Wars, was a complete disaster, and George didn't like working with Jimson, so he fired him and instead hired Richard Chew as the lead editor, who had previously edited The Conversation for Francis Ford Coppola. And of course Marcia Lucas, and then Paul Hirsch, who was De Palma's regular editor. Now, the legend of Marcia working on this film is true. I do want to say before I go into that Star Wars is very much a film that was made in post-production and had a lot of very talented people working on it. There really isn't one person that made Star Wars what it was over the large group of talented people behind it, incredibly talented people, I should say, behind it. It's more of the talent of all these amazing people that brought this film together. There's not one person that really stands out as the person who made it. But anyway, Marcia is credited with the following sequences in this film. I'm sure she did others, but this is at least what we know. To help the film more with levity, she championed certain parts stay in. Chewie yelling at the droid on the Death Star, the kiss for good luck between Luke and Leia, which George hated because it was cheesy and people would laugh, and Marcia felt it was good that people laughed. That was the kind of good time that he was going for with Star Wars. Also, I'm pretty sure she didn't know about that whole brother-sister thing because, gross, but at least they, never did that again. So, I've always read a few times she edited the TIE Fighter Millennium Falcon fight after leaving the Death Star as well. The most important and biggest sequence she would work on was the Death Star trench sequence. This was potentially one of the most important sequences of the whole movie and one of the greatest battle sequences in film history. Marcia spent months and months perfecting it and changing it. It really is one of the most edge-of-your-seat amazing sequences that you can't help but jump up from your seat with joy. And the whole movie is riding on it. We've seen Luke go from a farm boy with dreams,
I want to learn the ways of the Force and become a Jedi like my father,
finally becoming what he dreamed of. And we see Han Solo not be the dick we always thought he was. We see Darth Vader get not really killed so he can come back in the sequels. What? It's the culmination of the entire movie. Really and seriously, if it doesn't work, the whole movie really doesn't work. And it not only works, it makes you jump up and cheer at what you just witnessed. It's not just that Star Wars succeeded, it's the editing, it's the special effects, it's George Lucas, it's really motherfucking everything, and seriously, holy shit, did they just do it. But here's the thing, if you watch that sequence, it's really something entirely made in the editing room. Like, do you ever watch that and think, who is Luke talking to?
Luke, you switched off your targeting computer. What's wrong?
Like seriously, who is that guy? And everyone in the Rebel base is just a bunch of people just like looking at each other. Who other than Leia and C-3PO are all these people? I'm sure they have like dumb Star Wars names and stuff, but in context of the movie, none of them matter, and none of them are who are talking to Luke. In fact, when he says, "I'm all right," it's actually off screen. The trench run in Star Wars isn't amazing because you love it, and I love it, and it makes everyone love Star Wars, and it makes you care. Not just care, it makes you so invested in the incredible intensity of everything being on the line. With this sequence, everything was on the line for the Rebels and for Luke and for Han and for the movie. It really has to work for everything, and you are rooting for that sequence in such a way that it's undeniable. It makes you leave on one of film history's all-time greatest highs. It's great because it's clearly made by an editor who knew what the fuck she was doing, which is so epic. It maybe is the closest thing we'll ever get to the Odessa step sequence in Battleship Potemkin, and don't at me because that shit is fucking true. Marcia Lucas is legendary for the emotional and fighting for the soul of a movie that wasn't even fighting for it. Finding it and wielding it out of a film that didn't have it and making it feel so right, you can almost never believe it wasn't supposed to happen in the first place. If there was ever anything you can remember anyone for this movie, it's possibly this sequence.
Marcia always said, it makes no sense. There's no setup, there's no anything, but...
If the audience doesn't react when Han Solo flies in the Millennium Falcon, this movie's not going to work.
And it went gangbusters. That was the third standing ovation. And there's no setup or anything, but emotionally, it just worked.
Star Wars opened and was a huge, massive hit almost immediately. It was completely unexpected. It changed Lucas's forever, making them extremely wealthy and successful, and did really change everything. They literally delivered one of the most significant films of the 20th century that also became one of the most successful films of all time. It really was something that no one saw coming, and it quickly became the highest grossing movie ever. And Marcia would win an Oscar along with her fellow editors for editing Star Wars.
The winners are Paul Hirsch, Marcia Lucas, and Richard Chew for Star Wars.
In fact, she's the only Lucas to win an Oscar for Star Wars, or at least a competitive Oscar for Star Wars, and the only editing Oscar the franchise ever won as well. It was actually her dream to win, and really a professional high and a major end to what was probably a pretty insanely dizzying high of the year. Marcia didn't really edit as much after this. She helped Scorsese with New York, New York after his editor died, but that was really her last non-George Lucas movie. Scorsese would try to get her to come back after that, but she never really did, and would eventually work with his main editor for the rest of his career, Thelma Schumacher. She also did do some uncredited work on More American Graffiti, or she's often cited as having done something with that film. She's also often cited with having an uncredited role on Empire Strikes Back, but I actually couldn't find much about any specific part she worked on. I'm sure she probably did something, I just don't know what it is. It should also be noted that other than her, one of the major editors on the original trilogy was Paul Hirsch, who was the only credited editor on Empire Strikes Back, as well as his work on Star Wars. He really deserves a lot of credit for those films. He still works as an editor today and is probably still known more for being Brian De Palma's go-to guy. Between Empire and Jedi, Marcia did help with one other thing.
And remember Raiders of the Lost Ark?
Yes.
Marcia was the last person to see it. And the movie's over, and we're all patting one another on the back, Stephen and George and Michael Kahn, great editor. And all of a sudden Marcia says, "Say, fellas, I don't want to rain on your parade, but just one thing." And everybody goes, "What?"
What happened to Marianne?
Yes, that's what happened to the girl. And we go, "Oh my God." We left her tied to the stake.
We left her tied to the stick when all the Nazis get melted
That's
away
right.
and heads explode. And there had been a scene written in the script. There was a scene where they were in San Francisco and they were coming, and he was coming out of a meeting, and she's like, "Let's go get a drink," and they never shot it because they didn't think they needed it. I said, "I don't want to leave Marianne on the stick.
Right.
We need to shoot that." So George went out and George shot the second unit scene.
San Francisco.
Of them coming down.
Yeah.
They shot it at the
City Hall right
City
there.
Hall.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was kind of.
Start-
The movie needed it.
Oh,
It needed that
everybody
little bit of
recognized
closure.
it in that moment. That's exactly the right note. It needs to be corrected.
It also should be noted with Indiana Jones that the Alaskan Malamute that Indiana Jones got his name from, and who was also the inspiration for Chewbacca, was in fact Marcia Lucas's dog and not George's.
You are named after the dog?
Got a lot of fond memories of that dog.
Marcia Lucas's last editing credit was Return of the Jedi, which she edited with Sean Barton and Dwayne Duham, who is the guy sitting next to her in that interview. It was both because of the production problems on the film and to save their marriage that was already falling apart. They had adopted a daughter, Amanda, but with George never really being around, while editing Return of the Jedi, he was flying back and forth to the set of Temple of Doom, and Marcia had begun an affair with Tom Rodriguez, who made the stained glass windows in the library of Skywalker Ranch. However, on Return of the Jedi, we know she was responsible for the death scenes of Yoda and Darth Vader. It's often mentioned she worked on the space battle parts, which makes sense since they have the editor of the original Death Star sequence. They would want her to do the other one, but really that sequence doesn't mean as much to the film as the original one does. It's not as personal, and narratively it doesn't really mean as much, which is also the same problem with the similar sequence in The Force Awakens. After Jedi was over, Marcia divorced George and got a $50 million settlement in that divorce. This put George Lucas and Lucasfilm under higher financial strain because they just lost like $50 million. And in 1986, they ended up selling part of their computer animation division, or Pixar, to Steve Jobs for $5 million. Marcia Lucas has never really said much publicly since her divorce. She's done 2 interviews, one for the book Easy Riders and Raging Bulls, a book whose authenticity has been called into question before, and the other a year ago for Star Wars' 40th anniversary. She has a few post-Star Wars credits, like being listed as an executive producer on the film No Easy Way, and 2 shorts, but I'm fairly certain that's more of a funding thing than anything else. I know that through her daughter Amanda, who, by the way, is an MMA fighter. Like, really, did anyone know that George Lucas's daughter is an MMA fighter? Like, seriously, that's like crazy. Like, look it up. It's for real. I know that through her daughter Amanda, she keeps somewhat contact with George Lucas, but other than that, I'm not sure how much they are actually in contact anymore. Like what she thought of the prequels or the newer films. It should be noted that George Lucas didn't ask any of the editors of the original trilogy to come back for the prequels, and he really could have, not just Marcia, but I think Paul Hirsch should have been asked at least. Maybe he was for the prequels and turned it down possibly, but it doesn't sound like he did at all, and instead had each of the prequels edited by Ben Burt. I hope at some point Marcia Lucas will clear up a lot of this, or at least give an interview. What exactly happened to her is completely unknown. George Lucas rarely talks about her, and most mentions of her in behind-the-scenes books are minor. She's been completely removed. Lucas has a history of revising and re-editing his own history. He's actually tinkered with every film he ever made at some point. George Lucas has always found comfort in changing things or tinkering with things to fit his ever-changing vision, and Marcia is no longer a part of that.
And it really does come down to a simple rule of life, which is when you break up with somebody, the first rule is no phone calls. The second rule, you don't go over to their house and drive by to see what they're doing. The third one is you don't show up at their coffee shop or the things like you're going to run it. You just say, no, gone, history, I'm moving forward. Because every time you do, and you know, we all learn this from experience, every time you do something like that, you're opening the wound again. And it just makes it harder for you. You have to put it behind you, and it's a very, very, very hard thing to do.
I wish she would come out and tell her story. I feel like we don't really know what happened. What is the story of Star Wars from her perspective? What exactly happened, and how much more did she do that we don't know about? I would love to hear her review of The Phantom Menace or The Force Awakens or any of the Star Wars films after Return of the Jedi. But more than that, just what it was like making one of the greatest films of all time, working with two of the most significant directors of our time. I hope one day she does come out and says something. But until then, this is what we know about an amazing editor that clearly had one of the greatest careers in film history. I'm Jim Gisriel, and this was Deep Focus.